That the motion be agreed to.
Speaker.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's not often, unfortunately, that we're able to debate issues around arts, culture and heritage in this House, so I really relish that opportunity, but I'm sure you'll forgive my indulgence if I traverse very briefly some of the wider issues that sit within this incredibly important portfolio. And for Labor, it always has been an incredibly important portfolio. Probably that was recognised the most when Helen Clark decided to take on that portfolio as Prime Minister of New Zealand, because she recognised that the arts, and in particular heritage, was part of our national identity. It helped us create a sense of who we are, and heritage is intrinsic in that. And in particular, Helen Clark's passion for the history around our Anzacs, behind our world participation in World War I and in World War II, drove a lot of the projects which she championed, and she remains a great advocate in that regard. But I think, Mr. Speaker, it's really important to recognise that arts, culture and heritage doesn't sit as a passive portfolio that just needs to tick along in the status quo. There are so many things that we can be doing to support and grow and ensure that that sector is flourishing. And actually, unfortunately, in recent times, the sector in many ways has been somewhat diminished by choices the government has made. We only need to look at what has happened in public broadcasting. We've lost the Charter, we've lost TVNZ7, and ensuring that we have an appreciation of our heritage, yes, is encapsulated by buildings, but it's also encapsulated by our stories and our storytelling. But beyond that, things like, for instance, appreciation of music in New Zealand. It is New Zealand Music Month. It's very important to acknowledge that. That was started in 2000. Those are ways that we can celebrate New Zealand music not only domestically but internationally, and yet at the same time we seem to have ignored that we have a quota in New Zealand for New Zealand music, and if we ignore what is a voluntary quota, we run the risk of again seeing a lack of commitment to ensuring that we are supporting our local artists first domestically so we can ensure that they succeed internationally. Things like the large budget Screen Incentives Fund, introduced by New Zealand to support the film community in New Zealand, just left after Labor introduced it by this government, not looked at closely enough in terms of bolstering that fund until it was almost too late. This is not a portfolio, Mr. Speaker, that can just be left as a status quo with fingers crossed that everything will be okay, and yet that has happened far too much, I fear, within the arts, culture and heritage portfolio. Perfect example as well, I think, where just not enough attention has been paid in particular to heritage issues. We absolutely accept that in the wake of the Christchurch earthquake, when the Sierra Act was introduced, that there was a great need for safety reasons to ensure that assessment was placed on buildings with an eye to ensure that the city and its inhabitants were safe. Section 38 meant that we saw some vigorous demolition. But the time has come for that clause to be removed. We've already seen 50% of central Christchurch heritage buildings gone, 144 heritage buildings in the CBD alone. Now, we're not arguing that there won't be cause for some of those buildings to come down in the future, but surely we can now rely on the robust process around the RMA to determine that, rather than fast-tracking those demolitions through the arbitrary process engaged in by Sierra for these buildings. And that's what we're calling for. It's got plenty to do with the heritage. We're debating heritage. I think the survival of heritage buildings in Christchurch has got everything to do with the bill that we're discussing now, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we look at what's being proposed by the government around the Historic Places Act, I don't think we can underestimate what a fundamental this shift is for the New Zealand Historic Places Trust. And I concur and would like to reiterate the vote of thanks that the Minister made to the many, many serving board members and volunteers who over the years have contributed to the New Zealand Historic Places Trust. And Labour joins in thanking all of them for their service in the past and their ongoing service to heritage in New Zealand. This bill has tackled a few issues around things like archaeological consenting processes. It's ensured that there isn't duplication when it comes to the RMA. It has put on a statutory footing the new organisation of the New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Heritage New Zealand, forms a new governance structure around that body, and ensures that there are transition provisions between the bill disestablishing branch committees, removing 3 positions for elected board members, and instead creating 2 new positions for board members appointed by the Minister. So all of that is encapsulated by this bill. We did express some concerns during this process around ensuring proper transition from the Historic Places Trust to these new arrangements. We were concerned that transitional arrangement proposed in one of the clauses could be stronger. It was a clause added by the Select Committee. We thought it could be stronger by including supporting the Society's incorporation of a branch and providing a standard or template rules to assist branches. And I think we did that with the mind to the fact that the volunteers that have been involved in these organisations for so long, that surely lending a hand in that regard could only have been helpful. Ultimately, though, it's been our view that there were grounds for these changes. We did support them, but we also want to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that we put on record the ongoing issues around heritage protection in New Zealand that are significant, fraught, not easily resolved, but unfortunately go undebated in this place and have gone undebated for far too long. And I want to traverse a couple of those now. Mr. Speaker, the issue post, obviously, the Christchurch earthquake has been increasing insurance premiums around heritage buildings. Now, that's an issue on one level, obviously, for when they're Crown-owned buildings for the Crown to cope with. But often, of course, we're seeing heritage buildings that are in private ownership, where owners no longer see the fiscal gain for them in owning a building that perhaps they might lease, that now has a significant insurance cost attached to it. Now, if you were to take this example, for instance, and apply it to a small town like, for instance, Pouhere, I'm not sure how many buildings they have that might be listed, but in Pouhere, a number of beautiful historic buildings in that place. Many will be in private ownership. Insurance premiums being what they are, and their ability to bring in rent to cover that is significantly diminished. So what are we likely to see in those cases? Well, not necessarily through any desire by a building owner. We will see, I'm sad to say, demolition by neglect. And what provisions are there to try and prevent that from happening in some of these, in some of our towns and indeed our cities? Another challenge we consistently see is planning laws not meeting the public's expectation around heritage protection. There have been countless examples in Auckland where we hear the mantra again from heritage groups, this must never happen again, and yet it does, time and time again. The process of proper listing of heritage buildings comes up every time there's a review of a unitary plan in our city in particular as well. And all of this must surely lead to the conclusion that it's time for a national statement on heritage issues. That would be the way that we could set out the parameters, the guidelines, the public expectation around heritage in New Zealand. Now, Labour has called in the past for Select Committee to review this issue and all of the tangled web of heritage issues that at a local level we continually come up against, and unfortunately that was voted down by this government. But I say again, Mr. Speaker, yes, we support this bill, but we support a wider review of the considerable heritage issues we continue to face, which are particularly stark at present, and that will only be to the benefit of New Zealand's future heritage and preservation of heritage.
I call Maggie Berry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak to the third reading